All right, here we are. We got Bryan Samms on the podcast. Bryan, good to see you. Thanks for joining me.
Hey, Nate, it's awesome to be here, and thanks for the invitation to talk about this important topic.
Yeah, I always enjoy talking to you. I wanted to talk to you about pastoral compensation, which is a loaded topic. And I know you're very shy, very reserved. It's very difficult for you to speak what's on your
Right,
mind. Um,
right.
no, in
Well,
all
yeah,
seriousness,
I'll do my best to just shoot it as straight as I know how. So, uh, it is sensitive, though. I think one of the reasons why pastors have such a hard time talking about pastoral compensation is because it seems to be self-serving.
yeah,
Obviously, but yet it really, when you think about businesses or um, employment in general, I mean, who doesn't discuss with their employer what their compensation is going to be and make that a part of their evaluation strategy as far as if they're going to be able to take a particular job or not. So I don't
right.
know why it is so odd for it to come up, other than you feel like, well, I'm talking about myself, but I think if you were in any other profession, it would be okay.
Yeah, for sure. Right. I mean, pastors are people too. I think we forget that sometimes. They have bills and they have a family and they have, needs that they need to take care of. So it's not a bad topic.
Hmm.
We don't need to ignore it or pretend it doesn't exist. But yeah, I think pastors, for that reason, they're hesitant to talk because it feels like, well, I'm self-serving. I'm not supposed to be in this for money.
Yeah,
Um,
right.
well, like let's just lay the groundwork because we'll talk some of the nuance of 21st century American church culture and all of that. But just at the outset, let's lay the biblical foundation. The Bible talks about pastoral compensation. So, what would you encourage a pastor or a church congregation as far as like, hey, we can lean into this conversation because the Bible speaks to it.
Yeah, first, I mean, obviously, First Corinthians 9 is virtually an entire chapter about it, and
Hmm.
Paul's in a discussion of what we would call Christian latitude, or reasons that some Christians would do certain things and other Christians wouldn't. And then he gives an example in chapter number 9 of that he was well within his apostolic or pastoral rights to accept financial compensation for his work, but he volunteered not to do it in the case of Corinth for one reason or the other. But let me just read a couple of things. This is great. He says, and he's given his first reason why pastors should receive compensation. He said, whoever goes to war at his own expense, who plants a vineyard and does not eat the fruit of it, who tends a flock and does not drink the milk. So he gives the first example. Who, in what other world does somebody work and they don't receive pay? And then he goes to Moses and he says, Moses said in the law, you shall not muzzle an ox while it treads out the grain. Is it an oxen that God is concerned about, or does he say it altogether for our sakes? He's given us an example. You don't ask an oxen to work for you and not feed him. And then he gives another example about the priests in the Old Testament. He said, do you not know that those who minister the holy things eat of the things of the temple, and those that serve at the temple, or excuse me, at the altar, partake of the offerings of the Lord? Even so, this is verse 14. Even so, the Lord has commanded that those who preach the gospel should live from the gospel. That's a commandment in the New Testament concerning taking care of pastors. And then, of course, 1 Timothy chapter 5 says in verse 17, let the elders who rule well be counted worthy of double honor, especially those who labor in the word and doctrine. For the scripture says, you shall not muzzle an ox while it treads out the grain, and the laborer is worthy of his wages. And
Hmm.
so, I mean, frankly, the Bible tells us we're supposed to take care of at minimum, the primary shepherd who's feeding the flock, or we might call it the lead pastor. I recognize there can be some lay eldership or lay pastors in a congregation, and that's fine. But the one who is laboring in the word of God, preparing the food for the sheep, leading the flock, the church has a responsibility to take care of him.
Right, right. That's really good. And I think those two passages right there are definitive. There's really not room for, well, I don't know. I mean, it's pretty cut and dry.
Now, to be
Um,
fair, a guy could choose for one reason or the other to be bivocational or co-vocational, some guys are calling it now.
Yeah. Right.
And that's okay. If there's a good reason why, and I can think of a couple reasons why. Number one, you're willing to take a smaller work to put some effort into it, to lean into it.
Mm-hmm.
And so you're willing for a season, maybe even for a long period of time to do that. Number two, maybe you are in a mess when it comes to Social Security taxes. And maybe, that's a huge topic too.
Yeah.
But maybe a pastor's into his 40s like me or 50s, and he's like, oh my word, I decided to opt out of Social Security. That was probably not a really smart idea. And I don't have any retirement savings. So maybe he might need to go get a job somewhere to pay into Social Security
Right.
so that he can still receive some benefit from Social Security. And I would really caution guys to think about that, because
Yeah.
Social Security, it's one thing, the income is one thing, but the bigger thing is the medical benefits, because
Right.
by the time you're 60, 70 years old, you're going to be paying some very heavy medical bills for health insurance. So I'm 43 right now. I'm out of Social Security. I do not recommend to be out of Social Security, but I've also paid enough quarters in to Social Security that I will draw benefit. And if I wasn't, then I would go get a second job right now so that I could pay in. So those would be a couple reasons why maybe I would choose for maybe a season or whatever to not be compensated from the church, which is well within our liberty to not do under certain circumstances.
Right. Right. I mean, are there times where you would give advice to a pastor to say, you probably shouldn't get paid by your church? Is it pretty limited, those examples?
Yeah. Well, you said when I shouldn't.
Shouldn't.
Oh yeah. Yeah. I would think, I think a guy's got to come in with, let's just take a guy who's looking at a church. You've got to decide if God's calling me to do this, then I have to be realistic about the situation that I'm taking. I took a church of 40 or 50 people 6 years ago. I thought they were not going to pay me very well, and I was willing to walk into it for whatever circumstances they were going to offer me. As it turns out, they had some savings and they were willing to offer me a full salary, which was nice. But I had other options. I could preach in other churches. I could teach in seminaries to make up the difference. I would just tell a guy, look, if you're willing to take a church and try to revitalize it or try to plant it or whatever, you need to be willing to do whatever you need to do if you believe that God's called you to be at that particular church. So yeah, it may be a hard season. COVID, as an example, may have been a season where churches, their offerings plummeted.
Mm-hmm.
And I would say that I am not first and foremost in the ministry for money, but I have to also be realistic about money. So if I believe God's called me to a place and they can't take care of me the way I need to be taken care of, then I'm either going to have that conversation with the leadership or I'm going to work outside of the church in order to take care of my family.
Right. Right. Is there a rule of thumb as far as like church size or their giving that kind
Well,
of
I think,
delineates that?
yeah, my rule of thumb here, of course, now I'm in a church of 250 people and I have multiple staff and things, going on. So my rule of thumb here is that our compensation of our team never exceeds 50% of the overall income of the church. You can never go on attendance, because attendance is a terrible marker. I
Mhm.
have, like I said, 250 people, but our per capita giving is very good. Um,
Right.
that's 250 people. That's adults, children, everybody. But then when you think of giving units, we have X amount of giving units, but that's high for our size of church. And so you may have 500 people in your church, but they don't give very good. So you can't go on size of church. You have to go on the what has been established as your regular giving. So for what I do, I just budgeted for next year. We're getting ready to approve our budget for next year.
Mhm.
And our budget is increasing by 25% next year across the board. So then I can raise the compensation level to 50%, which means I can either, one, take better care of the team that I have, or two, I can add an employee if I want to. And because we started so small, my first recommendation to the deacons was, I think we need to raise our employees up and then bring in a couple of part-time hourly workers
Mhm.
to make up the difference in workload. And so that's how I approach this. If let's say I had a church of 100 people, 150 people, and the pastor was only making $45,000 a year and he had 2 young kids. My suggestion to that church is, if you're able to, if your giving is able, raise his salary or his benefits and bring in an hourly part-time worker to make up some of the other load, whether it's janitorial, secretarial, those kinds of things. And I think one of the biggest mistakes pastors make, at least, and I know I made it, is that I was always looking to hire the next assistant pastor. And I think that's a huge mistake.
Mhm.
I think you should, first of all, make sure that the senior pastor is taken care of, his family's taken care of. And then most of the time, the first needs that you really have in a congregation is not a youth pastor or a worship pastor. Frankly, it's somebody to clean toilets and sweep floors and, cut the grass.
Right.
And because your church is growing, and if you try to do all those things, you're going to get stomped. Not to mention, it's far more inexpensive to pay an hourly worker to do certain jobs that you need to have done than it is to bring in a whole nother pastor and a whole nother family. And so those are some things that I would consider as I move forward. Don't be too excited to hire a second assistant pastor when you're just squeaking by yourself. And I could give you I won't tell you a name, but I know a guy who his church was growing. He even sacrificed some of his own salary to bring in an assistant pastor, which was a huge mistake. He had to move into a less than desirable apartment situation. Ultimately, his wife got disgruntled, discouraged, and left him. And he's not in the ministry anymore. And I'm not saying it had all to do with the financial decision, but I'm saying he redlined his family and redlined his responsibility in order to bring in a helper, when the truth is pastors are not doing a very good job training their own people and engaging them in ministry. In fact, Nate, next year I'll have the biggest church budget I've ever had, and I'll have less money going into salaries than I've ever had.
Right. Yeah, and the secular world gets it as far as employee retention and making sure that key employees are taken care of, because that's going to be the longevity of the church is in those core employees, be it your lead pastor or your pastoral team, if that's the situation. So like for a pastor, let's say a pastor is looking at a church, he's considering it. Should he ask, hey, what's the compensation package? And then kind of the follow-up question is, should he then negotiate? What would be your advice to somebody as far as trying to navigate that compensation from the church?
Yeah, that's a great question. I'm not a good model for what I did, because I've always been a little bit more, we're talking about walking a fine line between faith and commitment and reason. And to be quite transparent, I've always been the guy who leans in a little bit more on faith and let's just do this and God's going to take care of it. So I did not ask about compensation when I came to the college I taught at in California or to the church I came to here, until they told me they wanted me, and then they talked about money. Fortunately, in both cases, the compensation was fine. Now, but let me give you another example, because I now have changed my opinion on that. Okay. So just this year, I have adopted 3 kids in the last 2 years. I now have 5 kids. I paid my own way through my doctoral studies. I just graduated with an earned doctorate. And my church has grown from 50 to 250. We've got a new property. We're in 50,000 square foot. We used to be in 18,000 square feet. We used to have 40 parking spaces. We have 160 parking spaces. Went from a half acre to 6 acres, and it's a different ball game now. Right. And I just came to the deacons because I've been taking some outside work, preaching and teaching in schools and things of this nature. But I was stretched out pretty thin. So I came to the deacons and I said, guys, look, I'm going to say this. I'm not asking for anything. There's no ultimatum here, but this is the truth. And I haven't had a raise in 4 years. And I said, I'm coming to you because I believe in my new life stage, I need a raise. And then I gave them comps. I know we were going to talk about this. Where do you get your information at? So I think this is a good place to insert it.
Yeah.
There's two sources that I know of healthy comps. There's churchsalary.com.
Yep.
And I think I paid a $99 annual membership for our church to have that. And then number two is Guidestone. Guidestone has a compensation. This is the Guidestone Southern Baptist Convention, which I think is the best gauge, whether you're Southern Baptist or Independent Baptist or whatever Baptist you are. It doesn't matter. We're all Baptist. And so the Southern Baptists have a better gauge on their compensation. You know, one of the weak things about being independent, not that this is a philosophical discussion, but one of the weak things about being independent is there's no data trail. You can't say, well, independent Baptist pastors make so-and-so, so-and-so. Well, we don't know because they're so independent that they don't know. But Southern Baptists are more networked. And so Guidestone puts out a compensation study every year. And you can actually go and you can go in and you can click, I'm in Florida. My church runs 250 in attendance. My pastor has 5 children. He's got 20 years of experience. He has an earned doctorate. Click go.
Yeah.
And it actually has a chart and it just tells you, well,
the
average pastor.
Publicly accessible?
Yeah. Okay. You don't have to have so you can just go to Guidestone. I would just do a Google search on Guidestone compensation chart. I don't think they did one in 2020 because of COVID, but the most recent one is 2019. Okay. And I got to tell you, man, I was shocked. I was far underpaid by those standards.
Right.
And so if I were going to candidate, or I were encouraging a pastor how to help your leadership go through this, I would say use those 2 resources, pull up the charts, the study's already been done for you, give it to your finance committee, and say, I want our church to pay its employees. And you can do it for assistant pastors, youth pastors, worship pastors, part-time people, and just give it to them and say, this is our standard. This is what we should do. And our church now, I'm at about 80% of where I should be right now. My assistant pastor, Aaron, is at about 60% of where he should be right now, which is maybe he's closer to 70 now. But I've already told him in the next 5 years, you will be at 100% comps to the area. And I plan to be at 100% comps at our area. And our deacons have been great about this. They understand it. I mean, you give it to a secular guy, a deacon, or a businessman in your church, and you say, this is what churches are doing for their pastors. This is what we should be doing for ours. And it's a fair thing to do.
Yeah, I think being forearmed with that knowledge is huge, and just being able to say, this is not what I'm not just making this up. I'm just not just pulling these numbers out of thin air. There's actual data to back that up. It is interesting. You kind of alluded to, there's a huge disparity, it seems like, at least anecdotally for me, from churches that I've seen as far as their attitudes towards what they pay their pastor. It's like, the whole like, God, it's God's job to keep our pastor humble and it's our job to keep him poor, like that whole idea. But you see certain churches that have that like Ebenezer Scrooge type attitude towards their pastor's pay. But then other churches, it's like they're incredibly generous and they take care of their pastors very well. It doesn't seem to me like it falls down denominational lines or even like sub-circle lines. Like I've seen it even within the independent Baptist realm. I've seen both extremes. Like, where does that come from? Why is that even?
Well, I mean, if you go back about 50 years, 1970s, you're seeing this attitude and it wasn't, you're right, it wasn't just independents. It was the most happening churches in those days, Southern Baptists, Independent Baptists. They're coming out of Bible Baptist Springfield. They're coming out of Howes Anderson College. They're coming out of all the Southern Baptist seminaries, and they're launching out. And you'll hear this talk by leading voices in those days. Hey, bless God, go out there and scratch off a spot and trust God and go to the mission field with no support, and they're great. They're amazing stories of faith. The problem is that those voices led congregations to believe this is the way it was supposed to be. So the answer to it is the retraining of congregations through leading voices, through podcasts like this, through sermons. I preach 1 Corinthians 9 and 1 Timothy 5 in my church through exposition. So I just feel like the only answer is you've got to teach them and you got to talk about it. And when you're armed with scripture and you're armed with the data, and let's say you come with that, and a church is just like, preacher, we don't give a rip. You and your 17 kids are going to live on 30 grand a year. Then that might be when I say, you know what? I can pastor anywhere and I can't do this. Or at minimum, again, if I really feel like I'm called there, that's fine. If your job is to keep me poor, then my job is to make me, I was going to say wealthy. That's not really the word I was looking for. My job is to take care of my family. So if you're not going to take care of my family, I'm going to take care of my family. So I'm going to go get a job because I can't live on $35,000 a year.
Right.
And again, these conversations are hard, but you know what I'm finding, Nate, is that the guys in ministry, guys in particular, they just don't like tough conversations. You know, they shy away from stuff. And this is the reason why some of our churches and some of our fellowships are in such poor condition, because we just won't talk about it. We won't open up I'm not afraid to sit down with my leadership and tell them. Like the other day, my wife and I were going through some challenges, not in our marriage, but just with some time and other things. And I just called my deacon and said, look, I need some time off and I'm taking it. And this is what I'm going to do. And they're very generous with that kind of thing. But I think whether it's health, whether it's personal life, whether it's ministerial associations, we're so accustomed to just doing what we do without any kind of conversation about this is what it should be, or do we need to rethink this? Yeah. That we just live with the way things are without even giving it a second thought. And I think that's really sad.
Yeah, I mean, that was really well put. Kind of going back to the 1970s and that whole attitude, it brought me full circle back to 1 Corinthians 9, where it's one thing for a minister, for a pastor to say, hey, I'm going to voluntarily kind of reduce my pay or do this without pay, and I'm going to try to step up by faith. But that doesn't negate the obligation of a church to say we should view this as our duty to take care of you. And if you are voluntarily saying no, then that's one thing.
Yep.
But otherwise, we want to step up and make sure that you're reasonably compensated.
And I did that in 2019. Our church went through a tough time. You know, we were going through some philosophical transformations. And so I lost some people. I lost 75 people in 2 weeks. And so it was a church split. It was the longest time before I could say the word. But now I can just say it. It's okay.
Yeah.
But we took a 25% pay cut voluntarily. And fortunately, our church bounced back within about 4 months. And when January of 2020 hit, the deacons came to me and said, Pastor, here's our finances. We're excited. Things are bouncing back. We're going to also repay you what you lost. So they cut me a check in January 2020 for 4 months of lost pay.
That's great.
And so, you know, there again, it's a culture that you have to be willing to create. It's a culture that you have to be willing to talk about. And some people don't know any better unless they have a leader. They're not going to know any better.
Right. So like coming back to just a little bit more of the practical side from a church perspective, like where would you say it's appropriate, or when should the church start looking at adding paid staff? I like the idea of, hey, you know, we can do some part-time, some hourly to fill in just some gaps around some maintenance type work, that sort of thing. But when is it time to say, all right, we need a youth minister, we need somebody to take care of media? You know, when are those benchmarks, would you say?
Yeah. So, you know, I think one of a good benchmark, and again, I'm assuming that all things being equal, meaning you're growing your church the correct way, so there should be some financial proportion there. I'm not talking about you say you run 200, but 175 are kids on the bus. Okay, that's not, you know, these guys talk about running 300, but the fact is they only have about 70 adults. And so I would say when you have double-digit adults, okay, maybe 120, 130 people total, you're more than likely very overwhelmed. I've heard that the busiest pastor in America runs about 120 to 150, and he doesn't have an assistant. And I think that's typically, again, the finances are going to be in proportion there.
Yeah.
I think so. A church, if their finances are there, I would almost add like 10% of a gap. So let's say that, again, my number is 50%, 50% of the total budget.
Mm-hmm.
And let's say under that 50%, I've got about $40,000 of a gap annually. And then I'm going to add 10% to that just so that I'm not redlining my church. So I would say, numerically, it's probably going to be about 120, 140 typically. And then you just want to see that you have the consistent budget space. For me, that's a quarter.
Mm-hmm.
I'm looking at a quarter. I mean, I can have a huge month of tithe, but I want to make sure that that's trending.
Right.
So I've been watching mine. I've been watching mine for now a whole year. We have consistently been 25 to 30% over budget this year. And so that's where I got my budget number for next year.
Yeah.
And so I would tell a guy, hey, look at your numbers. Let's say your budget is at $200,000 annually for your church. You make $60,000. That means that you should have about $40,000 in there of wiggle room, unless you're doing something stupid like you're in a. That's another thing. I mean, what if you took a church that's in some kind of massive debt?
Right. Yeah.
Like Kerry Schmidt did. And if you've ever talked to Kerry about their church was all, financially troubled. Mine wasn't. I had no building payment.
Mm-hmm.
We have a mortgage now, but at that time we didn't. And so I had more flexibility. But if you're paying a $10,000 a month note or a $15,000 a month note on a church building, you're not going to have the luxury of hiring a bunch of team members. So that's my rule of thumb. 50% of the total receipts is for staff. And then within that, how much do I need to pay the senior pastor? What's left over? And that's going to gauge how much I can afford. And again, I want to urge anybody that listens to this, before you hire a pastor assistant, look within your congregation at who you can train to help you as a part-time or even volunteer assistant for, you might have an older man in your church. I've got an older man in my church. He loves old people. He visits hospitals. He visits widows. I don't do hospital visits. And maybe I should. I don't know if I should or not, but I do have this man and he's a volunteer. Why would I pay somebody? Why would I pay an outreach pastor or a care pastor when I've got a free guy right there to do it? And same thing with children's ministry. We have a lady that directs our children's ministry. She's awesome. She loves it. Why would I hire a children's pastor? I'm just not going to do it. It doesn't make any sense. So now I have me and I have an administrative pastor, and he takes care of operations and he leads that team of volunteers in operations. And so my next hire, if I do hire somebody next year, it will be a part-time worship leader. That will be my next hire. And it all fits within my little formula there.
Yeah, that's great. Yeah, and it's right. There's nothing wrong with having paid staff in those areas and those ministries, but a healthy church recognizes that people are equipped with gifts that God's given them and they need to use them in the church. And so sometimes churches get the mentality of, we don't serve. That's why we pay pastors. They do all the service. We just attend. And that's
absolutely.
not the way it should be.
And like another little tip I would encourage you. I just read a great book called The Pastor, a Memoir by Eugene Patterson, the guy that wrote the Message Bible. Mm-hmm. And he wrote a memoir of his pastoral years. And he said that for 28 years at this church in the Philadelphia area, he had 10 secretaries all at once. And they were all volunteers. For 28 years in a congregation of 500 people, he never had a paid secretary. And I know that there are guys out there, if you just looked around you, you'd have a lady that'd be willing to come in and volunteer on the phones or doing bulletins. You got to think outside the box. I am not so sure that this next generation of church leadership is not going to look more like I'm describing than this slew of paid staff members. Right. So what I would be encouraging guys to do is, first and foremost, make sure that the lead pastor is taken care of completely, and then judge your next steps according to what you can afford and what your genuine needs are.
Yeah. How often should a church reevaluate and adjust staff?
I do annually.
Okay.
I have a prescribe 3% raise for all staff annually unless there's a greater need. Like in my case, I asked for an immediate 5% raise in July of this year after adopting my third kid in the last 2 years. And that was a big ask. And I basically said, look, I mean, here's my status. So, but then starting in January, on top of that, I'm getting a 3% raise, which is my normal annual raise. So there may be a situation where, like my assistant pastor is an example. Right now, it's just him and his wife, but they're planning on having a kid. So next year, his raise will probably be closer to 10% to compensate for a child. And for me, I'm willing to not hire a new staff member to ensure that the man who's been loyal and faithful to me for 5 years is taken care of, so I don't lose him over something silly like you don't pay me enough.
Yeah,
which
right.
he doesn't ever complain about, but I think you know what I mean. So
Yeah, for sure, for sure. And I think that's good. I think that's a good rule of thumb, 3%, because that's the average cost of living. Things get about 3% more expensive.
I just try to do what, like, I feel like normal people in the normal world do. I'm not trying to be worldly. That doesn't make me worldly. It just makes me,
Right.
it makes me have sense. If the corporation down the street is going to give a 3% and maybe more to their top performers, why would I not graciously take care of guys? And in addition to that, at Christmas, I give a $100 bonus per year of service. So this year coming up, me and Aaron have completed 5 years of service. So at Christmas, we get a $500 bonus.
Yeah.
And as long as we stay, you add another $100 each year for a Christmas bonus. And that's probably not extravagant, but it's at least something nice that we do for them.
Yeah, for sure. What are your thoughts on like schedule throughout the week? So you're hiring staff, you're saying, all right, you're doing the youth, you're doing the media, you're doing children's ministry. Is it, hey, you're here 9 to 5, Monday through Friday, you're working Sunday, we have midweek service. Like, how do we?
Yeah, I am not an office guy. So like I'm in my bedroom right now. That's where I'm at, which I'm at my standing desk, the one in my room. So we just don't have an office culture at our church. Now you talk to the next guy, he's got an office culture. My thing is you have a job description, you have a compensation. If you're full-time, my rule of thumb is this: think about a 40-hour week plus Sunday. Think about that. Mm-hmm. That doesn't mean I'm keeping track of your time, but you need to think that way. You need to think, okay, I've got this job description and it should take me between 30 and 4 hours a week to accomplish it. Plus I've got Sunday, and we only have Sunday morning. Yeah. So I'm talking like half a day. So my team would be there Sunday morning from about 8 o'clock to about 12:30. So that's about a half a day. And then everybody takes Saturday off at our church. That's what we do. And then no, that's not true. I take Monday off, and then I take about half a day on Saturday off as well. For my hourly employees, it's the same thing. My secretary is 30 hours. She makes $30, or not $30 an hour. That's not what she makes. She works 30 hours. And so I just tell her, you need to generally think like this. You need to think, I work about 9 o'clock in the morning to 4 o'clock in the afternoon with a lunch break of 1 hour. Think about it like that. So, and it helps me as new things come up and I'm adding responsibilities and we're stretching constantly. I just keep an open conversation with my staff. I just say, hey, I've got you 30 hours a week. How's it going? I hired a secretary back in May, I think it was. And I've asked her every month, how's it going? How's the workload? And, just keep that conversation going. And then if somebody ever came to me and said, Pastor, I really feel like I'm working too much, then I'm going to sit down and go, okay, 30 hours a week is 9 o'clock in the morning to 4 o'clock in the afternoon with a 1 hour lunch break. I don't pay you for your lunch break. Okay. So why don't you chart for me a couple of weeks of what you're doing during that time? And we'll see if I'm overstretching you, I will either add 10 hours to your work week and pay you more, or I will split some of your responsibilities and bring somebody else on. Right. Now for my full-time guys, which I only have, I got 2 right now. One's getting ready to go pastor, but I'll use Aaron. He's my assistant. Aaron gets 2 full weeks of vacation plus 2 weeks at the holidays, so he can give the whole week of Thanksgiving and a whole week of Christmas off. So really he gets 4 weeks off.
Yeah.
He also gets every major normal national holiday off. And he gets 1 day a week off, and he can miss 2 Sundays. So I mean, I feel like I don't work them that extreme, but that's the way I think about how I would compensate somebody, which is another reason why, quite honestly, in a church my size, I mean, people can overthink it if they want to. I just don't need a lot of full-time guys. You know, we don't run 700, 800. I don't have a daycare and a Christian school and 15,000 things. We're just a church. And, you know, I use 100% volunteers for janitorial. I use 100% volunteers for buildings and grounds. I have a deacon team that takes care of all that stuff, and we're just not going to pay people to do it. I believe in volunteers. I believe in the church. Every church every church member has a function. So I'm going to be a little unorthodox. Man, I'm not going to load up my church staff. I'd rather load up the individual staff members with compensation than load up the team and stretch everybody out. So that's more my way of looking at it.
Yeah, I like that approach, and I like that philosophy. Some people may balk at that and say, "Oh, it sounds like you're taking advantage of your church members." No, you're not. They want
No.
to serve. They want to be involved. They want to help their church in the capacity that they know how to. And some people love doing landscaping, and
Yeah.
that's their ministry, and it's great. Why would we say no to them wanting to serve in that way? And
I got a brand new Christian in my church. He's from Hawaii. He got saved here, baptized him. He runs a landscaping company.
yeah,
He came to me and said, I want to use my company to bless our church. What am I going to say? Are you crazy? Am I not going to? So I'm going to pay the guys I'd have to pay $1,000 a month for lawn care. I have 6 acres now, huge land, all kinds of shrubs, and he does tree work for me, does everything. I would be crazy not to do that. And then, you know, I think about children's ministry. I mean, if I'm not running 1,000 people or 500, 700 people, do you really need a children's pastor? I mean, or do you just need some faithful person to help you get it moving, order your curriculum for you, recruit some teachers along the way? I think, and here's the deal. I think part of the problem, Nate, is many guys that have been trained in ministry. I'm going to talk about specifically independent Baptists for just a minute. They were trained at colleges that were attached to huge churches, and they got this mentality that this is the way it works. And the fact is that 80% of churches are less than 100 people in attendance average.
right.
It's just not normal. Okay. I'm thankful. My goodness, I'm thankful. But you got the average guy out there. He's never going to pastor more than 100 people, no matter what he does. And he's got to have a more realistic picture of the way this works.
Right.
And if he thinks I'm just going to hire it all out, he's missing the greatest opportunity that he ever has, which is training the people that you have, letting them serve. And of course, if our church adds another 100 people, it's not going to change what I do. What will change is if programmatically I have to do some things to accommodate what's going on. Then I might hire, because it's not, look, I can pastor 500 people or 250 people. It's all the same. I mean, it's a crowd of people I'm teaching and preaching to. It's program and the way you're using your facility and the way your week looks that matters if you actually need staff or not. And I think that's a good way to look at it.
Yeah. Yeah. That's great, man. Bryan, this has been such a helpful conversation. I know there's a lot of younger guys in ministry, probably between 25 to 45, that listen to this podcast. It's just something that I think people want us to talk about, but not a whole lot of people want to step up and volunteer and say, I'll talk about it. And so I really appreciate your willingness to just be open and frank with us. If somebody wants to connect with you, what's best ways to get in touch?
Yeah. Well, I'm on Twitter at Bryan Samms. I'm on Facebook. My public page is Pastor Bryan Samms. And don't do a personal friend request on Facebook, because we only do like a few people. So don't take it personal when I ignore it. So it's like a fan page there. And then the Bryan Samms podcast is a great tool we probably have a lot of the same audience, I would imagine. So if guys want to connect with me there. And then of course, my email is just pastor@rivercitybaptist.church. I'm just better with email because it allows me to get back with people on my own timetable. And with 5 kids and a busy ministry, I'm not always accessible without, some kind of plan. So, man, I'd love to hear from guys. And if I can help anybody individually, they're always welcome to reach out to me. I do try to make phone calls back to people. So,
Yeah. Awesome. Well, again, appreciate it, Bryan. Thanks so much, everybody, for listening to the episode, and we'll see you on the next one.